Say a few things. George didn't want a formal service. I think mostly because he thought nobody would show up. Anyway, so thank you all for showing up. So we've got a couple things I guess we want to say. Sharon and I have some prepared remarks, stories, and then we have some friends of George's who are out of town, who couldn't be here, but had a few things they wanted to say. So Sharon will read them, and then there's more. So.
All right. So the first one is a very short and sweet one from my dad's brother. My dad's only surviving family at this point. Both of his parents are dead, and his other brother is dead. And it's very short, and this is what he wrote, and he's a very simple man. Dear Sharon Elizabeth, I'm sorry for the loss of your father and my brother. George and I did not always see eye to eye on different things, but at the last of his life, we patched things up and we both found the Lord. I feel very confident that he is with our Heavenly Father. I love you, Ed. I love you, George. Until we meet again, I love you, Ed. So there are a bunch of people here who are from a euchre club that my dad joined maybe 3-4 years ago, I think. Apparently he was very well loved there, and so they're all here. And I got a really nice email from one of the people. I got several very nice emails from people from the group, but they're doing something in his honor, so I thought I would read it. And this is an email that went to the euchre group, and it says, the meetup group lost a great man this past weekend. For those of you who had the pleasure of meeting George, you already know what a stand-up, fun, great man he is. It was found out that he lost his battle with cancer on March the 8th. To honor his memory, I can think of no better way than getting together as friends and playing a few games in his honor. I had the pleasure of knowing him for almost 4 years, and in that short time, I got to know what an honorable man he truly was. He always greeted me with a hearty handshake and a joyous hello. He epitomized what the group was all about, good times and making great friends. I would hope that anyone who had the pleasure of knowing him will come out and honor his memory by playing a few hands of the game he loved. Donations to the American Cancer Society are appreciated. Please join us in honoring the memory of George, by coming out and playing some games with all of his euchre friends that night. So I thought that was very lovely, and I thank you all very much for doing that. This is a letter that some friends of his from Wichita actually wrote to him when Dad was not able to really talk on the phone anymore. He really had lost his ability to be able to open up his phone and recognize that you needed to open it up and press a button. And so they would write letters to him instead of actually calling him. And I won't read you the whole letter, but this was a part that they were really saying goodbye to him, and I thought it was quite appropriate to talk about now. And it's from this couple, and their name is Ed and Connie. I'm so grateful for your friendship for the last 22 years. We had a lot of fun playing golf, even when you threw your clubs. Going to the Rockies games where you ogled over all of the young women, eating barbecue, Chinese, etc., and taking in the movies. You were so dear to come to Wichita and spend time with Eddie and I throughout the years. We thoroughly enjoyed our weekends together with you. It is our prayer that God be your companion and comfort you through the very difficult times. Please know that you are always loved by us throughout the many, many years. Love, Ed and Connie. So now I'm going to move on to some letters from when my dad lived in Denver. He was a remodeler there, just like he was here. And he got into a circle of friends of 3 or 4 women, 3 in particular that I think he really had lasting relationships with. And these women were very strong women. They were very dynamic. They are very strong women. They're very dynamic women. And they had very great, wonderful relationships with my father. And as Dad was in his last days, all 3 of these women came at separate times to spend a whole weekend with him in the last time of his life. One of them came from Denver, one came from Phoenix, and one came all the way from Hawaii. And I'm going to read the letter from Megan, who is the woman who came from Hawaii. You wouldn't think that it was possible that a 20-something left-leaning liberal and a 60-something right-leaning Republican could spend virtually 5 years in a bathroom together, swinging hammers and not having a single hospital trip. That was George, though. He could alternately cuss out the plumbing while cutting his bald head for the 12th time that day and be incredibly patient while I attempted to sort out how the dang sink went together. He was a study in contrast, a tough guy with the heart of a lion, and that made him all the more endearing. I know I'm not the only one to have shared these experiences with him, but I feel incredibly fortunate to have been part of his life. He took me into his family, let me shake his beloved granddaughter out for change by her heels, and had me over for dinners with them, and he made me feel welcome and loved. She moved to Chicago for a little bit, by the way. Even long after I left Chicago, he always made time for me, harassed me about my love life, and told me how to remodel a house over the phone, even flying out to Los Angeles to help me keep from starting electrical fires. His generosity was genuine and boundless. When I saw him last month when I visited Chicago, we talked and laughed over memories. I told him that whenever I golf, I think back of him as I chucked the club into the woods. So keep an eye out for those flying clubs because I'm sure going to miss him terribly. He was a great man with a kind heart, and I will carry him in mind until I see him again. And this one is from Janny. Janny lives in Phoenix, and he also knew her in Colorado, and she was also a construction helper with him. I met George in 1991. My partner and I had purchased a house in Denver, and we needed some help getting items fixed and replaced. We called George, and thus began a long and deep friendship. I had grown up on a farm and knew how to use tools to fix and build common home projects, but I lacked the confidence and real experience. George changed all of that by hiring me to help him on remodeling projects. He was an amazing teacher that within a couple of years, George was working for me on high-end remodels, including one home in Denver that is a regular showplace and on the Denver Home and Garden tour. Along the way, we got to know each other so well that we could have an argument about work, politics, or religion by lunch, and then we would laugh and eat together. We often disagreed, but always respected each other's views. We spoke bluntly and honestly to one another, but never held a grudge. The truth is, we agreed on so much about life, but we challenged each other on our few differences, and we even became better people because of it. George was family to me. He would protect me and stand up for me like a father, and stood by me like a loyal sibling. He considered me family too. We share some basic qualities and like loyalty and respect, and that was at the top of both of our lists. My life has been so rich because of the beautiful friendship we shared and the life lessons that George taught me. I was fortunate to see George in the weeks before he left us in the flesh, and I said goodbye for the last time. I asked him to watch over me and told him that I would see him again on the other side. I left knowing that Sharon, Peter, and Rebecca would lovingly care for him in the end. I know he is still there for me, and I know that everything he was ever confused about or could never understand is now crystal clear. I miss you, George, and I know now that we can all rest in your peace. So I have one more before I'm going to turn it over to Sharon, and this is from Caroline Dankowski. Caroline used to live in the neighborhood. She lived right across Irving Park, and we used to, there was a euchre club that was already going on in the neighborhood, and they never invited Peter and I because they were full, so we started our own euchre club. And this was one of the ladies that was part of the group. George, Gigi, Grandpa George, Mr. George. George was my constant in Old Irving Park, my true friend. Friends come and go, kids change schools, neighbors move away, but George was my constant. The one I touch base with here, there, and check in, and he was the one who called me when we moved. They moved to Connecticut about a year ago. A friendship was forged over drywall and Werther's candies. I consider my year apprenticing with George as his handy, quote-unquote, girl, and I was invaluable to him. As I learned carpentry skills, I learned about George, his fierce love for his family, and his granddaughter, Rebecca. No prouder a grandfather have I ever seen. Every play, every performance, and every school event, he was there. And I was the lucky one to hear about it. Ha ha. Even in the younger years, when kids were off key, he was always proud. I know he would have rather been somewhere other than Chicago, but to tear him away from his family, no sir. maybe a vacation to Dubuque, Iowa or Colorado, gonna get me some chicken fried steak. But he was back to be with his number one and his number two girls. George could be quiet and shy at times, too shy to come to our block parties while he was working. To hear him cuss when laying the floor or to tell a dirty joke, you could always count on him for that. George, who would listen to Rush Limbaugh religiously while we worked. Don't get him started on politics or elections. Trading stories, he listened, he really listened. He was a shoulder, a confidant, and a friend. I smile at our combination, a crazed mom with 3 kids in her 30s and a salty older man. He would tell me that I was his number 3, behind Sharon and Rebecca, of course. I think he told that to all his girls. But even if my calls weren't often enough, there were threats to drop my ranking to number 4 or number 5. We both loved euchre, so Grandpa George gathered up Peter, Sharon, Cheryl, and Andy, and a few others, and we'd have game night. He drank his sodas while we all drank lots and lots of wine. Lord, was he patient on those nights, or tried to be, when the girls would sing out, "Diamonds are a girl's best friend," and focus on the game. There are many great memories of George coming to my aid, fixing a flat, repairing and remodeling our house, chatting more than working because we just really enjoyed each other's company. His insanely strong hands and great neck rubs were constant companions. And I will wear my birthday present, a carpenter's belt with a pink hammer, with pride. I think he would rather I forgot the day he realized his dating bracket had slid up a notch or 2. While sitting in a restaurant grabbing lunch, he smiled at a young thing who he thought was making eye contact with him. This continued for a few moments until George realized she was flirting with the younger guy with the full head of hair behind him. Carried George so ticked off in the realization that the young brunette was no longer a realistic dating option. The thought that women in their 60s should still be in his dating pool was unthinkable, God bless him. He still saw himself the handsome, dashing 20-year-old that I saw in his pictures. George, you are free to be that guy now. Of all the goodbyes I said when we moved, his was the hardest. I cried the most with George. I got the best hug from him. George, we will meet again, my friend, and we will hug again. I love you. Okay, so Sharon, I'm leaving the best to last for you.
Oh, those people, they said so many true, for those of you who don't know the rated of George, he was raw for sure, but he did it to make you giggle half the time. So I spent it took me quite a long time to come up with the words to express my feelings for my friendship. So let me try and get through this. Dear George, and Peter and Rebecca, as I sit here reflecting on our time spent together, trying to find the words that would adequately express over 20 years of friendship and all that you have meant to me, I find myself at a loss, as mere words cannot express my love, affection, and gratitude for your presence in my life. I know your body is gone, but I feel your presence and see you here, alive and living in the people who are and always will be your friends and family. For now I can only share a few of the things which I so much loved about you, and the stories and memories will continue to be spoken and shared for a lifetime with those who loved you. Where to start? George the handyman. I met George through a good friend of mine when I asked about needing some work done at my house. I had an endless supply of projects and things for him to do, and George was capable of doing all of them. He could hang drywall, do electrical wiring, plumb bathrooms and sinks. George was the go-to guy and quickly became the handyman to the lesbian community of Denver. I still giggle at this life path for George, as he would often tell me he was a red-blooded American man, and it was obviously to some frustration for him that none of his clients were going to be available for him today. I will never forget going out the door one day to work and finding my car had a boot lock on it. I apparently had forgotten to pay a ticket. I had an important meeting to get to with a group of doctors, and I was stuck. I went through my head trying to think of all the people in my life that I could call and rely on to help me. I dialed George. He dropped what he was doing, jumped in his van, and headed my way. He was busy working, and he stopped what he was doing to help me. He saved me. That was the first of many times in my life that George helped save me. Grandpa George. Who knew George the handyman could read? George had just finished the day working on a project at my house, and all the girls were going out to dinner and wanted George, the honorary lesbian, to come with them. Nope, George said, I have to read. I replied, come on, George, you can read anytime. Nope. George said, I have a date with my granddaughter, little Rebecca. I read to her before she goes to bed. I believe in my memories, if my memory serves me correctly, that this was a weekly ritual which we all quickly learned that George was not going to deviate from. George was out for social engagements on those nights. And that gave me a first glimpse of the love, devotion, and commitment that George had for his family, and just the type of man George was. George and I continued to work on houses projects over the years, and as Rebecca continued to grow, the pull for him to be close to her, Sharon and Peter, tugged at him. George decided to leave his life in Denver with all his beautiful women who loved to be close to his family. It was a painful loss for all of us on so many levels. Cancer, not George's but mine. At age 39, I was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. I spent 2 years unsuccessfully being treated by doctors in Denver and was told to put my affairs in order. I then went to MD Anderson in Houston, to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, where they offered little hope to my diagnosis. I finally found a doctor in Chicago that I had heard had success in treating ovarian cancer. I knew who just to call. It was George. Every 3 weeks for 3 years, George would dutifully pick me up from the train station. We would go to his house, drop my bags, and go to dinner. The next day, George would drive me up to Evanston for treatment and pick me up when I was done. If he had a skip click, he gave me the keys to his truck, and I would drive myself. Sharon and Peter were also in this ritual and pitched in for rides and support and housing when George needed help. It was truly a team effort. George left no detail unattended and had it all meticulously planned. After 3 years and 52 treatments in Chicago and visits to George and family, I decided to continue my treatment endeavor as my cancer was stable and in remission. My Chicago dates with George were sadly over. I had the world's finest doctors tell me to pack it in, but as my good fortune and fate would have it, God sent me to Chicago for a reason. It was to heal with the aid and care of my friend George. He continued our friendship via phone and mail. George came to Denver a couple of times to play golf with his golf buddies and to visit his Denver friends. The visits to Denver ended when George's back failed to cooperate with his desire to golf. I often teased him that he needed to lose the baby he had been carrying for way longer than 9 months. I encouraged a healthy diet with foods that were green and no more Diet Coke. George would roll his eyes and chastise me with the proverbial Sharon Elizabeth White tone, and because my name is also Sharon Elizabeth. And I knew that the conversation was going to go no further about vegetable eating and loss of the Diet Coke. What I learned about George over 20 years, George was a true gift from God. I'm so glad that my journey and George's were to be tied together in this lifetime. He was a man's man, and George was very comfortable in his own skin. He relished his ability to shock us with inappropriate statements, to get a laugh, and to get real. He was a dutiful, devoted, and loving father, grandfather, and friend to those who took the time to get to know him. He had a rough and tough exterior with the biggest, softest heart of gold inside. Rebecca, I hope you take Grandpa George's attributes of love, loyalty, honesty, integrity, devotion to family and friends and make them an important part of your life. This quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson is a fitting tribute to how George lived. He says, "You laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty and find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know even when life is breathed easier because you have lived, this is to have succeeded." George truly led a successful life with love, devotion, and integrity, and I miss him every moment of every day, and am happy to have been a part of his family and in his care, and I'm truly here because of him. So I love you all, Sharon, Peter, and Rebecca. Thank you for letting me be a part of your service.
Thank you, Sharon. That was just lovely.
Awesome.
All right, two more. Peter's going to do his. And anybody who wants to say a few words is certainly more than welcome.
You know, it's, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but there are just a lot of wonderful common themes in what Sharon's read and what Sharon White said, just in terms of the impact that George had on his friends, and just how meaningful he was. Hello, friends of George. I wanted to say a few words about George. Those few words turned into a few paragraphs, and then the next thing I knew, a few pages. No longer could I put a few bullet points on an index card to say what I wanted to. So forgive me if this sounds a little speech-like as I read. I wanted to keep it as informal as possible. I keep needing to remind myself that this is a celebration, but the label doesn't make the painful emptiness I feel any less severe. So allow me to share some stories and insight about George's life, the impact that he had on all of us and us on him. And since this is a celebration, I will pepper my stories with levity if for no other reason than that's the only way I can get through this. So George the kid, the guy forever a ladies' man. George the grandfather, the father, George the worker, George the friend. And Gigi, I know you're looking down because you said you would, and you were always a man of your word. Except, however, when it came to starting my projects on time or finishing them on time. But that's good enough for me. Sharon, my wife, was the product of two young, hormone-racing 20-year-olds. Her mom gets pregnant, and they did what most couples did back in the day, and that was they got married and moved forward. Never really meant for each other, and not mature enough to be able to work through all the challenges of establishing themselves as a couple, parents and workers. It crumbled in a few years, and Sharon found herself being raised by a single mother, herself a loving grandmother, but a predatory grandfather. Her dad was around, but at age 13, George picked up and moved to Houston, a decision he would later regard as the biggest mistake of his life. Sharon got to spend some summers with George, and they had a blast together, but his role in her life was limited. It wasn't until her late 20s that Sharon started to reconnect with her dad. She had met this amazing guy in New York. And she had to marry him. But this guy insisted on meeting her dad. So it started with a trip to Denver. George had cleaned up his act considerably by age 50, wild oats mostly sown and mostly depleted. A few years later, Rebecca was born, and Sharon made it clear to George that he would not see his granddaughter if he continued to smoke cigarettes. So with great willpower and newfound motivation, he stopped cold turkey after decades of smoking, at periods several packs a day. So the man with many obsessions, now just one, Rebecca. More on her in a little bit. In 2003, Rebecca was 5 years old, and we purchased the house next door. Not knowing exactly what we were going to do with it, but we had several options. On a Saturday morning in June, Sharon called George in Denver and George knew that we had bought the house. So we had kind of joked with George in the past, but Sharon said, hey, do you want to move in Chicago, live in the house next door? He said, all right, I'll think about it. That afternoon, he called back and said he would move in September. Was that soon enough? He sincerely asked, and he did. And I think that's the only deadline he actually set and met. George had already made a concerted effort to be a part of Rebecca's life, as Sharon White had talked about. Reading to her weekly over the phone in a ritual that lasted for years. His voice always fun, playful, warm, and lacking some self-consciousness that was heartwarming and made him approachable. Now this was an even bigger opportunity. So he moved out of his one-bedroom rental, loaded up his truck, and moved to Chicago with his tools, skills, and love for his family. That was about it. He really didn't like Chicago. Too far north, too cold, bad traffic, never sunny enough, too racially integrated, and too many damn names. But that's where his family lived, and to him that's all that really mattered. With just a little help from Sharon and I, he got his business rolling in Chicago, and many of you graciously employed him. You entrusted him with your house, your office, and with your wives. Sharon and I am truly grateful. You helped give his life purpose and meaning and the means to live it. So people would ask me, what's it like having your father-in-law living next door, expecting to hear just horror stories? But never they heard. George was always respectful of our space and privacy, never overstaying his welcome. It was a great skill of his. But he always insisted that I let myself into his house whenever I needed something, whether he was home or not. He was very opinionated, but knew when to express himself. He enjoyed being with his daughter and son-in-law, but it wasn't forever, would always be about Rebecca. If there were a man who worshipped his granddaughter, George was it. She got all that Sharon missed, what Rebecca needed, and then even more. It was his chance to right a wrong, to learn from his mistakes, and to do better the next time. Not exactly a do-over, but he was determined to embrace the opportunity and make the most of it. A very admirable trait, and one that I deeply respect. As a special friend of mine often says, it's not how you start, but how you finish. And George was determined to finish his life right.
Peter's written the great American novel here.
It's wonderful.
Timed it at 15 minutes, but I'm reading. George loved playing cards, as many of you know. He joined a startup euchre club, as we talked about, with a bunch of kids, many half his age and younger. I had the pleasure of being his partner one season. What a great time we had, and great experiences, just him and me. Memories for forever. But apparently that period, just a year or two ago, was on the threshold of short and long-term memory, because he didn't recall much of any of it recently. We'd always show up at the event early at a neighborhood pub, a great trade of Chicago, and have dinner there before cards. He'd greet many of the players by name as they filed in for weekly games. Invariably, we'd get our asses kicked, but have fun time ragging on each other and getting to know our opponents. George had a disarming quality that made him easy and just fun to be with. But he was never but just himself. In the car on the way home, he'd complain about the bad cards we were dealt, the good cards our opponents got, and just how bad of a card player he was. That would last just a few sentences, and then it was on. Then that was it until next week, when we just do it all over again. An easy way to get George off of any subject was to talk about his favorite topic, the ladies. Oh, he did love each and every one of you. Truly.
We know.
You know. And I know that many of you adored him and have shared your stories. George was a Don Juan in his own mind. Always tongue-in-cheek but incessant. He was a ladies' man, always knowing that all of the women wanted him and just couldn't keep their hands off of him. As if to compete, he would refer to himself as a more mature gentleman than, say, me or their husbands. He was very charming and always very trustworthy and respectful, regardless of the threats that he made to the women's husbands about taking them away while he had them alone. So George had his harem. Yes, there were many of you. And not just heteros. Gay women, too, endeared him. He was able to endear himself to. And as Sharon said, one Megan traveled all the way from Hawaii just a few weeks ago to say goodbye. What a guy, a man for all women, truly. Gigi, you are quite a stud. As some of you know, my dad died of this exact same cancer that afflicts just 3 out of every 1,000 people. And ironically, George's final diagnosis from pathology was on September 5th, the 4th anniversary of my dad's death. Many of you have donated to George's chosen charity, the American Cancer Society. Thank you so much. If you'd like to and you haven't, you can go to georgepark.com and you'll see a donate link at the top. And I also want to just take a moment to recognize Steve Gross, who's took all these photographs. George and I had spent George had back surgery about a year ago, and I took him to and from the doctors and hospitals constantly, and then as soon as that was, he seemed to be trying to get out of the woods for that, he then got his cancer diagnosis, and again we were back with the same neurosurgeon and the same routines, and a lot of time at Resurrection, and George would always want to do something for me and ask me, you know, what can I do for you? Can I buy you lunch? How can I help? And I finally said, you know, you can let me take, you know, have your picture taken. So Steve Gross graciously, you know, offered to do it, and you know, the pictures that we have are really just treasures and family heirloom. And I will just say to each and every one of you, you know, it's, you know, you think it's going to last for forever, but it doesn't. And it is really nice having these photographs. So I just encourage you to, you know, take some pictures and have something that's really nice to keep. Sweetheart, I'm so proud to be your husband. You are bold and brave, nurturing and caring and courageous and forgiving. You look forward and not back, even all of my mistakes. You forge a life built around success, some conventional and some not. You are a fighter and a winner. After all the trauma in your youth, you could have easily grown up a bitter daughter and repeated the cycle of neglect and abuse as statistically you were destined to. But completely on your own, you didn't. You re-accepted your dad in your life on a whole new set of terms, ones of mutual respect, trust, and obligation. I'm so in awe of you because of that. I know you just always wanted to be your dad's girl, and that disappeared for a while, and you found yourself finding replacements with him, and that hurt deeply. But you invited him back into your life and enabled his true devotion to reemerge, and it did, bigger and stronger, and so enriching. You let him into your private world. It was the greatest. I accept your unspoken apology a daughter could ever give her dad. You were so good to your dad, and I know you're still thinking, still not good enough. But you've never, ever, ever been fully satisfied, and this case is no different. You enabled him to finish right and die with dignity. No unfinished business, all loose ends tied up. You gave him the perfect child, the perfect grandchild. Yes, more about Rebecca. Always and forever the center of his universe. He would do absolutely anything for you, sweetheart. Even fall asleep on the sofa babysitting, and then disappear back home before I could even park the car and walk back into the house. George would talk to me about Rebecca as if I weren't her father. As if I didn't know her that well. He would brag to me about being the perfect child. Her gymnastic skills, her ability to articulate, how she's grown, her accomplishments in school. It was beyond unconditional. If Rebecca had set fire to the house, I'm sure George would have stood back and marveled how evenly the house was burning. Or how clever that she was to use fuel and a fuse so that she wouldn't injure herself. George gave Rebecca a personalized ornament every year, starting with the year she was born. And now it's enough to fill a little tree, which is a wonderful keepsake. Sharon and I thought for sure that his playful manner of the tickle monster in her younger years, which she would eventually outgrow, he wouldn't. But he did, and he continued to find things to tease her and admire her about, like her, quote, beautiful mind, because we're not supposed to be focusing on her physical appearance. And later, her legs of steel. Even as he was near dying, he still claimed that he could outrun, quote, that little brat. Bug, you were a wonderful granddaughter to Gigi, always responsive to him, generous with hugs and kisses, your many trips together to exotic places, like the old Bowser dog, where he'd lift you up to the counter so you could place your order, when seated, battling for shared French fries. Later, years to Chipotle, and he always threw in that extra syllable. And then Barnes & Noble.
Barnes and Nobles.
Barnes & Nobles. All right, I'm almost done speaking. So, George, you promised to be sitting on your front porch with a baseball bat, watching Rebecca return from some anticipated date with a boy. And I'll miss your implied protection. I'll miss watching you why can't I get through the funny stuff? I'll miss watching you with a golden nugget, chop up your eggs, break up bits of crisp bacon with your hands, add it to the blend-in of hash browns and a heavy dusting of ground pepper. All this washed down with 2 Diet Cokes before 9 a.m. I'll miss destroying a gorgeous cut of breast meat for you, turning it into shoe leather on the grill at your request. And if that wasn't enough, a quick zap in the microwave so that we could all eat together. But then you'd sit back and enjoy your meal every bit as much as I did. A dyed-in-the-wool Republican, Rush Limbaugh lover, pickup driving, xenophobic, murder mystery reading Luddite, all-time country music level, and high school educated. I share none of these traits and appreciated all of our differences, even though you did drive me crazy sometimes. This man taught me so much about family and love, how to swing a hammer, how to tape, float in sand, the difference between a rip and cross-cut, what a compound miter joint is. You were always a welcome addition to our little family here in Chicago, and I will forever admire and miss you. I miss you, big guy.
All right, one last one.
Can I go before you say something?
Oh,
Yeah,
yes, dear,
Rebecca,
I'm
come on.
sorry.
No, it's fine.
I forgot.
Dear Grandpa George, before you moved to Chicago, we would read stories together over the phone every night. Sorry. You and I would have our our own copies of the book, and I would sit in Mom's office in the big chair, and you would read to me. Then you would ask me about school and all the activities I did as a kid. Once you moved to Chicago, our readings were more frequent, but when I later learned how to read on my own, it turned into afternoons of watching Jeopardy and the ever-constant CBT, cookie break time. On the topic of cookies, you taught me that if you took the tops off the Oreo cookies and blew on both sides, all the calories would fly away. I obviously believed you, much to my mother's dismay. As I got older, weekly trips to Chipotle were always present. You and I would each get the exact same thing every time, and after dinner we would hop back in the truck and drive 10 feet to Barnes & Noble. You called it Barnes & Noble's. I always wondered why we didn't walk from Chipotle, but I guess that was just your thing. Once at Barnes & Noble, you would go sit in the cafeteria, and I would wander through the bookstore trying to find a book. If I weren't back in the cafeteria in 5 minutes after arriving, I would receive a frantic call from you wondering if I was okay. I always was. Then you and I would split a cookie and hot chocolate and read our books till it was time to go. Me growing up more, during these car rides to Chipotle, you constantly told me that I could not start dating until I was 35, boys had cooties, and if you ever saw a boy come to my house, you would sit on your front porch and beat him with a baseball bat. You were only slightly kidding about the last one. Grandpa George, you were always keeping me safe no matter how little the circumstances. Some nights when my parents would go out for dinner and I would be home alone, I would hear a creak in the ceiling or think I saw a shadow outside. Of course, I would get so scared, and I called you every time asking you to come over and check it out. It was always my imagination, nothing being actually wrong. But maybe somewhere in the back of my brain, I just wanted to have you come over and be with me. In more recent years, you taught me how to work the lawnmower, and every Sunday I would mow the lawn, you and I taking a cookie break halfway through. Being a handyman, you were clearly the best at building things. That's why, instead of buying a regular doghouse for Lily, you and I built one from scratch. Or more, you did, and I just handed you the occasional hammer. Lily never really liked the idea of being outside without my mother, so the doghouse soon adapted into a turtle house for Sheldon. At least someone ended up using it. From feeding me countless cookies to the ever-constant calls seeing if I were okay, you were always looking out for me. The things you've taught me, I will always remember. I will keep our memories close to me, some of your last words asking me not to forget you. I never will. I love you so much, Grandpa George. Thank you for everything you have done for me. Much love, Grandpa's girl.
Okay, Papo, your name changed so many times in my life. You started out as Daddy, the most important name to me as a little girl. Mom always told me I was Daddy's girl, and some of my earliest memories are of feeling loved by you. At 13, when you moved to Houston and I saw less of you, you became Dad. And through my lonely teenage years and young adulthood, when I felt a deep loss without you, you became my father. You became Dad again when you firmly re-entered my life and I introduced you to Peter. And finally, when you moved to Chicago, you became Papo, Grandpa George, and finally, Gigi. I can never forget the beautiful wedding gift you gave us, the renovation of our first home. Little did I know that that 3-month visit would turn into 9 years of you and me rediscovering each other. I laugh now when I remember how earnest Peter and I were in our plans for our modest little house. And not once did you squelch our grandiose ideas. You simply figured out how to make them into reality. Often people would give me a second look when I told them that my dad lived next door, but you never overstepped a single boundary, never ever overstayed your welcome, never made me feel burdened by having you there. And while at times I felt guilty at not spending more time with you, not having you over for dinner more, not going to your fattening restaurant choices, you never once made me think that I had wished I had done more. What a joy it was to have you next door. The sense of comfort we felt whenever we traveled, knowing our house was watched over, our dogs spoiled, and a general feeling of well-being that you would take care of anything that may happen. Was there ever a grandfather that loved his granddaughter more? The unconditional love that you gave to that child boggles my mind. You told me often the biggest regret in your life was moving to Houston when I was young, and I know that you relived our last childhood together through her. And wasn't she the lucky one to be the recipient of all of that pent-up love? Papa, the biggest gift you could ever have given me was the unconditional love that you gave Rebecca. Because you see, you helped her develop into the young girl she is today. Independent, strong, and self-confident. All the things my stunted childhood caused me to find so much later in life. Because of your confidence in her and your love for her, she will not become a victim of sexual abuse. She will not be overwhelmed by demons. She will not need years of therapy to turn her into the woman that she will become. Because she is already firmly on that path that you helped set for her. What a nasty, nasty disease cancer is. How so incredibly sad it was to see you once so strong, so viable, so living, diminished to the withering being that you were at the end, so helpless and so lost without your mobility. Everyone tells me what a gift we gave you by being by your side the night you died, but holding your hand, listening to you struggle to breathe, wondering if you could hear me tell you how much I loved you, was nonetheless a horror. I know you were ready to go, and I know you had said all of your goodbyes, but that does not make it any easier for us, your family, living here, remembering you and grieving. You will notice your window shade is down, and I avert my eyes whenever I am in what I always call to myself the Gigi part of the kitchen. I can no longer trust myself to look out my kitchen window instead of seeing you eat breakfast or shining the flashlight at us to attract our attention. All I see is a reflection of myself, which I guess is really where you now are. Thank you for re-entering my life, and thank you for letting me share in yours, and may you at last find peace. I love you, Papa. Okay, thank you everybody for walking down memory lane. Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks for letting me.
Does anybody else?
I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but they're welcome to say something that they would like.
Or we can go back to the country music.
Well,
Yes.
I've got three things.
All right, can I just ask that you stand back here so I can
Okay.
capture this for forever? And
Oh, yes,
And
I
everybody
do
can see
definitely
you.
want to be captured.
Yeah.
I've got three things, and I'll try and keep it snappy. First, the one that I think encapsulates George for me. Peter and Sharon have heard this 1,000 times, but you know, we lived in the house to the north of George's house, and we were going somewhere one sunny summer afternoon on a weekend, and as we pulled out of our garage and started to drive south past the garage that was George's and somewhat George's workshop, the overhead door was open. Rebecca was with him, and I heard him say, "Oh, Rebecca, you think Grandpa can just fix anything, don't you?" And I went back to him later and said, "You just be grateful she thinks that." I remember fretting about how my yard didn't look pretty enough before a party to which George was invited, of course, because how could you have a party without George? And he said, "Don't worry, they'll all just be looking at your chest anyway." He didn't say chest, but there are children. And the last thing that for me kind of caps it, he always used to say to me, as he did to all his other girls, and I thought it was nice, he didn't just love straight women and skinny women and lesbians, he loved us big girls too. And he always used to say, when Alan is out of town, when Alan is away, when Alan's not home, I'll come over and keep you company. Well, there was a week weekend, a Super Bowl weekend, when he swore he would come over and keep me company because Alan has a religious observance with his sister and her husband, and he always goes there for Super Bowl, so I was free. And I knew George and I were going to a neighborhood party later. And I walked, he never called. He never came over. And as he never did. Not that I would have known what to do with him if he showed up. And I walked into the party and looked across at George and said, of all sad words of tongue and pen, the saddest are these. And without missing a beat, he chimed in and finished the poem, it might have been.
All right.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is not a goodbye, but just a really big party thanks for being here and you know, helping us through this challenging period. You've all been just so generous with flowers and cards and kind words and you know, drive-by visits, and it really just speaks a lot to, you know, the kind of community that we can have in our little part of the town here, and you know, people coming in from all parts of George's life just really means a lot to all of us, and hopefully this has been, you know, cathartic for you too.
Mingle.